Welcome to today's Cultivating Success webinar. This is part 4 in our integrated pest management series. Today's topic is biological pest control. I know many of you are watching the live class to receive your pesticide certification credits, and this particular webinar will qualify for credits. To receive those credits, you do need to participate in the entirety of the webinar. This webinar is brought to you by the Cultivating Success program, which was established in 2000 by University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Extension, and the nonprofit organization Rural Roots. We do an annual webinar series, and at any time, you can reach out to us through the Cultivating Success website to share topics you would be interested in learning more about. You'll also find all our upcoming classes and the ability to subscribe to our newsletter at cultivatingsuccess.org. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the slide handout will be posted on the Cultivating Success website and on the Cultivating Success YouTube channel. You do have to watch this webinar live to receive the pesticide credits. So I just want to put that caveat in case you are watching a recording in the future. At any time, you can type questions for speakers into the question box or respond to speakers' call for questions within the chat box. If you have any technical issues, our program coordinator, Kate Wood, is standing by to help you. Just type into the chat. If your sound becomes unclear and you are sure that that is on your side, you can go ahead and switch to the phone. To do that, just look at the audio control in your control bar, click on the up arrow and follow the instructions to switch to sound. With that, that's all of my introductions. I'm Colette DePhelps, one of the Cultivating Success team members. I'm really excited that we have another one of our team members, Samuel DeGray, here to talk about biological control. So Samuel, welcome. While we're transitioning to Samuel, we're going to do a quick poll. We would like to know just what level is your familiarity with biological pest control as we're starting this webinar. So you should see the poll on your screen. It's one quick question. Just give us an idea of your level of understanding of biological control methods. We have about 3/4 of our folks on the webinar today who have responded to the question. I will just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, Kate, let's go ahead and close that poll and share the results with everyone. So as you can see, the majority of people on today's webinar self-identify as somewhat familiar with biological control methods. We have one person that is very familiar and another person that's not familiar. So thanks for giving us that read. That's really helpful to Samuel as he starts moving through today's content. To ensure you get your credits, you will have needed to share your applicator license number that was in the registration, be present for the duration of the presentation, and we will make sure that your registration and participation goes to Desiree Wickwar, who will be making sure that those credits are applied to your applicator's license. Okay.
All right. Well then, if you guys are ready to get started, my name is Samuel DeGray. I am the new agricultural extension educator up in Boundary County, which is Idaho's northernmost county. I am a member of the Cultivating Success team, and I have a background in entomology and research in integrated pest management, especially in Idaho as well as Wisconsin. Desiree, this is essentially her presentation that she created. She had a medical emergency and is not going to be able to present today, so I am going ahead and filling in her stead. So here's just a little video of a mantis, which is a predatory insect and one example of a biological control agent. So some of the reasons why you might be interested in IPM. I think a lot of people think of IPM as being for larger scale commercial farms. It's not. It's very much something you can implement at any level of agriculture right down to like a single house plant all the way up to, thousands of acres of farmland. So you might be managing indoor urban pests, a home gardener, in the greenhouse, small scale, large scale. These concepts can be applied at any scale, basically. So if you guys have already been in this webinar, then you're already super familiar with this graph. There's a little bit of a highlight here on the beneficial aspect of this. So when you're starting out, your first step of IPM is always monitoring and identifying your pests and beneficials. And this is kind of zeroing in on the beneficial aspect of that. And when you're applying your treatments, whether it's cultural, physical, biological, or chemical, you don't want to just see how it affects your pests. You also want to see how it affects your beneficials because those beneficials also affect your pests. And in the case of pollinators, might also affect other aspects of your crop yield. Um, so yeah, basic for anyone who this might be their first webinar, first step of IPM monitoring action threshold. That's the point at which you might start managing a pest. Um, so if you're at that point, then you might choose a treatment tactic, and then you circle back around and monitor again and see how it impacted your crop or your populations of pests and beneficials. So going back to the pyramid of IPM, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is kind of the general concept here. Chemical treatments are often necessary and they do often work, but it's good to a lot of times think of those as kind of a last resort effort because, they're expensive, they can have detrimental effects on the environment and sometimes even non-target effects on other crops if you're not careful. So on Tuesday, we talked about cultural, physical, mechanical. Those are kind of like your environmental modifications to your field. Biological is the next step on the pyramid. Um, I would say it is quite different from all the other forms of control because you are working with live animals, and therefore it is arguably probably the most messy form of control. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So what is biological control? Almost all of you said you were somewhat familiar, so this is probably a review, but it's basically the use of living organisms to suppress pest populations. I think a lot of people, and maybe this is my bias as an entomologist, but I think a lot of people think of biological control as being using insects to control other insects. That isn't true at all. There's all kinds of things that you can use as biological control. There's beneficial fungi, there's beneficial nematodes, even something like using, you know, livestock to graze out a weed or something like that, that could be considered a form of biological control, even though I think it gets lumped into cultural or mechanical at the time. So losing living organisms as a form of pest management. And this is just a little list of those. You know, Once again, it's not just arthropods, even though that's a big chunk of it, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. But also all these other things. Bacteria is another one I didn't mention. So if you've been in the seminar before, you've seen this question, but just a general concept for the purpose of IPM. What's it for? And for this quiz, just throw your answers in the chat, please. Option A, are you trying to completely eliminate all pests? Option B, keep pest population below key economic or damage thresholds. Option C, use your knowledge of pest biology and crop interactions to inform your management decisions. Or D, B and C only. Give you guys a couple seconds there. Someone said that they don't see the poll. If you are able to see the slides should just be the poll itself. There's not like a poll that's going to pop up like there was at the beginning of class. All right, looks like everybody got it right, which is great. You're either smart and know your IPM or you've been in the seminar series before. Either way, it's great. Answer is D. B and C only. We are never going to completely eliminate a pest. Maybe someone has done that somewhere, but in practice, it's not going to happen. You're trying to reduce them to the point where they're not causing damage to your crop. So talking about biological control specifically, there's two major types. Augmentative. So if you think about like augmenting something that's like adding to it. So augmentative biocontrol is going to be actually physically adding in your beneficial organisms intentionally, versus conservation biocontrol almost kind of falls into that like cultural control territory where you're not intentionally introducing any sort of organism. You're managing your environment better so that the organisms that are already there thrive and therefore control your pest populations. So talking a little bit about augmentative biocontrol. So once again, this is intentionally introducing an organism into your environment to control a pest. Um, this can be quite difficult to get right, I will say right off the bat. A lot of times, I think when you talk about biocontrol, this is like what people are really excited about, thinking about let's release, some kind of bug that's going to get rid of our pest populations. And it can work, and it has many times in history, but oftentimes it can be difficult to get right. So some of the many things to think about when dialing in an augmentative biocontrol program is releasing during the right periods. Because if you just release a pest willy-nilly, especially if it's something like a parasitoid wasp, oftentimes they can only affect the pest at a certain point in the pest's life cycle. So you have to dial it in at that point. So that's going back to that monitoring step. You're monitoring both your pest and beneficial populations. Ensure survival after release. So you're going to want to release a kind of pest that is going to be able to survive in the environment that you live in. Some pests live around the world, then they're able to survive in both the tropics and the temperate region. And if you get a parasitoid from tropical Central America, it might not be able to survive in temperate Idaho. Um, and so just some other things that are good to keep in mind. You want something that's going to persist in your environment. If you release something and it just dies immediately, or it just disperses immediately, like it flies away and you never see it again, that's not going to be an effective augmentative biocontrol agent. And you also want something that can survive, lower prey densities after hopefully it knocks down those prey so it can keep having the effect over the season and it isn't just like a one-time short-term decrease in pest populations. You want it to be effective. Not every predator or parasite that attacks a given pest is going to reduce that pest population enough to show a significant amount of control for your crop. So that's something to keep in mind. And ease of rearing and handling. I mean, a lot of these pests and parasites have complicated life cycles, and they're not something you can raise as easily in a lab like you can some insects like a mealworm or whatever. So if all of these sound like they're difficult to get dialed into you, they really are, and they're probably even harder than this slide makes them out to be. So, you know, it can work, but I would say do your research and maybe even use this with caution. And one other thing to think about here is certain kinds of biocontrol agents have also become invasive when they've been introduced sort of willy-nilly into the environment. So you almost don't want something that's going to do too well in your environment as well. And that's another slice of the pie to think about. So here's some of the upsides of augmentative biocontrol. You have complete control over when you release your biocontrol, so you can release it right when the pest is at its most problematic or in advance of when the pest is going to be most problematic. You get immediate increase in the beneficial population because, the life cycle of a wild beneficial may not necessarily perfectly sync up with that. It might not be just feeding on the pest that you're interested in controlling. It might be attacking a large variety of things. It might be tied to some of those other things in your environment, as well as your local climatic conditions and all that kind of stuff. The more specific that the biocontrol is, that the better for augmentative biocontrol specifically. So that's like you want something that will only attack your pest and maybe some of its close relatives. And that goes back to you don't want something that's going to become invasive in the environment. Most pest species have a lot of neutral to beneficial close relatives, and you don't want this biocontrol to go off into the wild and start killing off of those harmless insects. And you also want it, once again, to be something that's going to create a large enough population and be effective enough to actually see a control effect. Here's some of the cons. Beneficials often disperse. A lot of them are winged insects. They can fly wherever they want, and there's often no incentive for them to stay in your field, especially because, oftentimes fields may not have as many different types of food or as many different types of habitat for them to hang out in. Um, our orchard manager up here in Sandpoint reported that he actually like uses some kind of glue to glue his ladybug wings shut so they don't fly away. Um, which once again just kind of speaks to how difficult this can be to implement well. It can be expensive. A lot of these predators and parasites are hard to rear, like we already talked about. So it's not a cheap or easy thing to mass produce them. Once again, the weather conditions have to be right and challenging in large scale agricultural operations, you have to release enough across your field for them to impact your insects, impact your pests across the field. And, it's the larger your operation is, the harder it is to implement. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but oftentimes the best scenarios where these work is in like a greenhouse where, first of all, there's less likelihood of them escaping and attacking other things or just going elsewhere. And second of all, it's a scale where it's easier to apply them, apply your augmentative biocontrol agents. So, moving over to conservation biocontrol. And I think, this is the side of biocontrol that maybe seems a little bit less flashy and exciting, but it's actually probably a lot more practical and a lot more, easy to implement across a wider variety of ag systems than augmentative biocontrol is. So this is like almost a cultural control method in some ways. It's really managing your field and your surrounding environment so that the beneficial insects and other organisms in that area thrive and then have a strong effect on reducing your pests. We'll talk more about this in detail, but thinking about what kind of habitat you have around your fields, how you apply your pests, and like what kind of pesticide you're using and how you apply them. These are all going to affect your beneficial arthropods. Um, so some of the upsides of conservation biocontrol, it's often pretty cheap. Um, Sometimes the best conservation biocontrol is actually like doing less, like maybe tilling a little bit less or maybe cutting down some of the shrubbery around your field less and creating habitat for beneficials. Once you get the practice dialed in, it can be kind of a self-perpetuating system. And it's more like a kind of longer thinking strategy versus it augmentative biocontrol is something that you just, introduce one time and you might often have to do, maybe every year, multiple times through the season even. Some of the downsides is that it requires careful planning. It might not target specific pests, so you might not see a strong as reduction in your target pests, but at the same time, it's probably reducing the populations of some other pests, which may not be a problem right now because there are other beneficial agents in the environment that are reducing them. It can be slower to work in some cases. Once again, augmentative biocontrol, you're introducing something right away. It's knocking down the population immediately if it's working well. This is once again more of a long-term thing, but it's also, arguably more sustainable in a lot of ways. So here's just another little quiz, and I kind of already gave away the answer to this, but which of these environments, so on one hand, we have a field of grain and then we have a greenhouse. Which of these do you think will be better for augmentative biocontrol or conservation biocontrol? And there's going to be one answer for each. Just throw your answer in the chat there. Give you guys a few seconds to think about that one. All right, we got a few people chiming in on the chat, and as far as I could tell, you guys all seem like you're getting the concept. Augmentative control is going to work better in a greenhouse because you're going to have more control over where those pests are going. They're not going to be able to disperse immediately like they would be in an open field scenario. Um, you might even have less diversity of pests than you do just out in the environment. Um, so yeah, this can be actually work pretty well in a greenhouse environment. It's probably one of the best places to think about doing augmentative biocontrol. And if you're just doing house plants, you can think of that as basically like a greenhouse. So you can work there too if you want to introduce some little bugs into your home. And then conservation biocontrol is best implemented for larger scale farming. And another thing, in a greenhouse, there might not be any naturally existing beneficial insects to even do conservation biocontrol because it's all about preserving the beneficials that are already there, right? Um, so yeah, good to see that you guys look like you're pretty up to snuff on some of this stuff. So moving on. So now dialing in on invasive pests. So especially here in the West, most of our pest species are invasive, but a couple are native. So when you think about an invasive pest, it might not have as many localized species of biocontrol around, but then again, it might. So what do you guys think? And just throw this one in the chat again. Which do you think will be better for an invasive pest species in terms of conservation versus augmentative? And don't overthink this one. All right, I'm seeing a mix of answers, which in a sense that I would take as a correct answer, which is really that it depends quite a lot. Invasive pests are notoriously hard to control, and part of that is because they may not have enough beneficial species to control them in the environment that they're being introduced to. So in that sort of scenario, yeah, augmentative biocontrol might be something that you look at. But then in other cases of invasive pests, there's enough similar species that are like them when where they're invading that there's enough biocontrol already in the environment. And then in that case, conservation biocontrol might work better. So it really depends. And that's the case for really all forms of control and all forms of IPM, but it really especially applies to biocontrol. It's a really messy, really hard to provide generalized suggestions for term of control. So we're gonna focus in on some specific biological control agents, and these are all gonna be arthropods, so like insects and their close relatives. But once again, even if I'm not talking about them, there are other forms of biological control agents besides just creepy crawly things, fungi, bacteria, all kinds of stuff. So one of the most recognizable forms of biocontrol is going to be the ladybug. So they're Desiree has them down here as generalist predators. I probably wouldn't call them that personally. I'd say they're somewhat specialized. They are kind of adapted to feed on a lot of like plant eating insects. So aphids are one of the most well known, and their lady beetles are some of the most voracious predators and best control agents of aphids. They'll also go after your scale insects, which are usually, as far as I know, not a thing in any sort of like outdoor crop in Idaho, but certainly can be found in a lot of houseplants. Thrips, which if you've never heard of that, they're small, tiny insects that can cause disproportionate amount of damage in all forms of agriculture and other, small, soft-bodied plant-feeding insects. So yeah, if you're gonna introduce augmentative biocontrol, especially like just in your garden, these are probably going to be some of the most effective. Once again, just do it with caution. There's actually a species here, the Asian lady beetle, that I believe was introduced as a biocontrol agent. You might have to double check that one, but either way, it's become a really common invasive species here, one that a lot of people complain to me about here in Boundary County because they like invade homes in mass and create a nasty smell when they get crushed and stuff. Um, Here's just a interesting little tip, entomology wise. A lot of these plant feeding pests can cause huge amounts of damage to agriculture, but they're really small. Like aphids, thrips, they're tiny, right? And they're hard to see, even for me as an entomologist. So sometimes when you're out in your field and you see a ton of ladybug larvae, that's actually a good indication that you might have an infestation of aphids or thrips or something like that. So that's another step in your monitoring process that you can keep in mind. Um, and these guys, like most beneficials, do the most help in their larval stage because that's when they're the most voracious and hungry. So that's that kind of to me they almost look a little bit like a lizardy kind of thing there in the middle. Those guys are doing the most eating. The adults eat stuff too, but just not nearly as much as larvae do. So moving on to a couple more. Spider mite destroyers. They're another species of lady beetle. They're really small. You're probably not going to notice them in your fields, but this is something that people will release sometimes as augmentative biocontrol. And they're specialized to feed on spider mites, which is great because in some ag systems, they're a massive problem. And also on the left here, on the left here, if you see that little dot in this picture on the far left, there's like this huge grubby looking thing. There's that little black circle. That's a spider mite destroying lady beetle. So most of these groups are of insects like ladybugs or thrips. They cover hundreds or thousands of different species, and some of them don't look the way that you're expecting. So these lady beetles are small and black and don't look like your typical ladybug that you're probably thinking of in your garden. But they're still beneficial. Moving on to another guy or group of guys, the lacewings. These are generalist predators too, and I think that that term probably applies a little bit better here. It says usually only in the larval form. That's a kind of a misconception that I've seen in a lot of these kind of talks. I don't know why, but they're predators in both the larval and adult stage. But just like the ladybugs, they're really most beneficial when they're in the larval stage because that's when they're the most voracious. And also the adults, even though they're still predatory, they also will take nectar and things like that too. So they're not as dialed in. And like in most adult insects, they're mostly focused on reproducing, not eating things. So they kind of overlap a little bit with ladybugs in that they go after a lot of those like plant parasitic insects like aphids and thrips and scale insects, which are, you know, massive problem in most ag systems. But they'll also go after small caterpillars and even eggs of other insects, which the ladybugs are probably not going to touch. So a little bit more broad in the things that they can control. This is an awesome picture that Desiree took of a um, lacewing larva eating a psyllid nymph. So they have like kind of like sucking type mouth parts, almost like an aphid does, but they eat other insects. So this one's piercing into that psyllid nymph and is sucking out its gut contents, which is good for us. Minute pirate bugs. This is kind of a generalist predator, rather as opposed to the other ones, which are a little bit more specialized. They're gonna feed on any type of plant feeding insect for the most part that is attacking your crops. Generally, they're going to feed on those guys when they're in the earlier stages of the life cycle because these are pretty small. And they're not going to be able to eat like a large caterpillar or something like that. But just for identification purposes, when you're out monitoring, if you look at the lower right-hand corner there, that kind of like black and white coloring is distinct-ish of the minute pirate bug group. Like if you look and you see a kind of small black and white spotted bug running around your crop, there's a decent-ish chance that that's what it is. Rove beetles, a great example of a generalist predator, very diverse, pretty much everywhere. And they're more like soil dwelling, so they're going to be attacking your pests, when they're in their earlier stages, maybe even when they're overwintering, or any of your like root or ground dwelling pests like wireworms. These are going to be one of the things that might be controlling them. Many species are predatory, many are not, but a lot of the ones that are common in agricultural systems are. And these are going to be some of the ones that you're really gonna benefit by implementing some of the conservation biocontrol methods that we'll talk about soon. Predatory spider mites. So not all mites are bad. Some of the mites will eat other mites. Some of them are generalists, some are specialists. These are one of the other things that you're probably not going to see them with your naked eye. These are one of the things that people will release as augmentative biocontrol for. So these are almost entirely used to control other mite populations, right? Like they're just too small to attack larger insects most of the time. I have heard, I think that they use them to control like certain gall midge larvae or something like that, but for the most part, they're used to control other mites. And they can be pretty effective, especially some of the most specialists, some of the more specialized predatory mites. And once again, because these are mites, they're so tiny. If you've ever had a spider mite infestation on anything that you've grown, you'll know that you probably aren't actually going to see any of the mites. You'll just see like the webbing that they create. So chances are these are probably present already if you're having an outdoor spider mite infestation and you're just not seeing them. So once again, something that conservation biocontrol might also benefit and increase the populations of. Parasitoid wasps, one of the most important groups of biocontrol agent. These are one of the most diverse groups of things in general. Some estimates place them as the most diverse group of insects, and someone who loves beetles would probably be super mad at me for saying that, but the papers are out there. Total huge range of sizes. The smallest insect known is a kind of parasitic wasp, and then some of them can be up to like, you know, 3, 4 inches long, which is huge for an insect. Um, Usually they're pretty specialized. So parasitoid, what that is, if you've never heard that term, is it's kind of like intermediate between a parasite and a predator. You know, a parasite is something that lives in or on its host but doesn't kill its host, and a predator is something that goes out and like consumes its prey. A parasitoid is something that lives in or on its host but eventually kills its host. So that's why they're beneficial as biocontrol. Um, some of the most common things that these are used to control in our area are aphids and caterpillars. Whiteflies, mealybugs in our area, because we have a more temperate climate, are mostly like greenhouse and indoor pests. We don't really see them outdoors, even though they're huge problems in warmer parts of the world. Um, so these are just some pictures of parasitic wasps. The lower right-hand corner is a good example of what a parasitoid wasp infested caterpillar looks like. Those little white things are all cocoons. Um, the other ones are pictures of them laying eggs in or on their host. The one in the lower left-hand corner is I forget what they're called, but they live in like the Midwest and East, and those are one of the gigantic ones, and they're like a couple inches plus long. They attack wood boring wasp larvae. Moving on to another generalist predator, the damsel bug. These are, I would say, one of the like unsung heroes of biocontrol. Really effective, really common. They're not actually that small as far as insects go. I mean, they can be, you know, quarter to half an inch long, even in some cases, but they're kind of these torpedo-shaped small predatory bugs, and they're pretty generalized. They'll attack most kind of pests. And yeah, their populations can be pretty big. They're one of the things that can come out first in spring and start controlling some of those early emerging populations of pests. So if you see these in your environment, don't be alarmed. They're there to help. Big-eyed bug, another unsung hero. Really common, tiny, and really hard to notice if you're a home gardener or just kind of looking at your field with the naked eye. They're another generalist, and they do kind of look similar to some other close related insects that are pests on crops. So the easiest way to tell them apart from those, and those would probably be like aphids or lygus bugs. If you live in southern Idaho, I'm sure you've dealt with lygus bugs, regardless of what you're growing at some point. The easiest way to tell these guys, which are these beneficial generalists, is that they have those big, huge bulbous eyes on the sides of their head, which is why they're called big-eyed bugs. And they do, as adults, have a little bit of that black and white coloring, just like the minute pirate bugs do. But, you don't really need to worry about telling those two apart because they're both good for you. You don't need to worry about either of them. But once again, the big eyes will also separate them from the minute pirate bugs. So just a little quiz. We've already talked about one of these. One of these we haven't, but you've probably heard of it or seen it. Which one of these is a pest and which one is a beneficial? And just throw your answers in the chat there. Awesome. I'm looking at the chat and I think, as far as I can tell, everybody's gotten it right. So, pest beneficial, it's kind of a case by case thing, right? Sometimes there's really closely related groups of insects, and sometimes one's a pest, sometimes one's a beneficial. There's kinds of ladybugs that are pests, actually. But in this case, it's a clear-cut example where these are two kind of wormy looking bugs. The one on the right is that lacewing larva that we already talked about. The one on the left is a wireworm, another huge pest in Idaho. I think a lot of people, especially organic gardeners, especially ones that might be a little bit new to the ag and IPM world, probably are dealing with wireworm and not even realizing it, but they're soil dwelling pests that um, feed on roots of a wide variety of crops. So they're a problem in root like tuber crops like potato and sugar beet, but they're also a problem in just any crop, including like grains are they're a huge problem in those just from feeding on their roots. Um, so, if you're a little bit new to the IPM world or to the entomology world, sometimes these can be a little bit confusing because maybe this might look a little bit similar to maybe the untrained eye, but I think everyone in this talk is probably pretty savvy in terms of some of those basic distinctions, which is your 100% test scores are what makes me think that. So this one is maybe a little bit harder, but once again, throw in the chat which one of those you think is a beneficial and which one you think is a pest, A or B. Awesome. Yeah, looking at the chat, once again, you guys are acing it. B is the beneficial bug that I just talked about, which is that big eye bug. And then on the left is a lygus bug. And even though you guys all got it, I think just from this comparison, you can see how this distinction can be a little bit tricky sometimes, right? Because the one on the right does look very similar to the one on the left. And once again, maybe it's easy to tell them apart in this blown up picture, but it might not be as easy to tell the difference in the field, right? So that's where knowing your pests, investing in the right equipment, like a hand lens, will probably be sufficient just to tell these two apart. But yeah, great job in terms of you guys and your knowledge of IPM. I can see that somewhat familiar thing was definitely justified in the poll from the beginning. So when you're monitoring and scouting, this is a good way to tell if parasitoid wasps are present, specifically in aphids, as well as some other plant-feeding insects. But if you look at these kind of weird shell-like, husk-like aphids in this picture, those are what we call aphid mummies, and that is what's left over after a parasitoid wasp comes and infests an aphid and completes its life cycle and emerges out, which leaves some of those big gaping holes that you can see in in this picture. And even though usually there's not going to be this many aphid mummies relative to the amount of healthy aphids, which are those, I think there's three in this picture where there's a few aphids that aren't as, white and kind of almost like a ceramic-y look to them. That would be like a regular healthy aphid. But if you see these in your field, that's a good thing. That means that there's parasitic wasps out there that are controlling your aphid population. If you're seeing this picture, that's a very good thing because those parasitic wasps are wiping out most of your aphids, which ideal scenario doesn't often happen in practice without tweaking some things. But so how beneficial are they really? Biocontrol, once again, is super messy. It's something you want to do a lot of research, especially if you're doing augmentative biocontrol. But Desiree went through some literature review studies that kind of did meta-analysis, and if you're not in the research world, the meta-analysis is when you look at a bunch of different research papers and kind of tally up statistics from what each one of them found. And the meta-analysis overall show that biocontrol does work. This paper showed a 130% reduce in a pest abundance, 139% increased parasitism, 159% increased pest mortality. Um, and this is across a wide range of crops and a wide range of different biocontrol practices. And I think this was mostly focusing on augmentative biocontrol. But once again, keep in mind that these papers do often report successful instances of biocontrol, and they might not be reporting all of the different studies where it didn't work. Um, so keep in mind that it can work, and when it works, it can work really well. It's just something that you really want to dial in. So if you're like a new farmer or even like a new gardener, I would stay away from augmentative biocontrol in like your first or second year of gardening or farming and really like dial in what your pests are and do your research in terms of like what biocontrol agents you might want to think about because it's not something you want to do willy-nilly. And if you do it willy-nilly, chances are it's not going to work very well. Um, so this is something that probably applies a little bit more to like the conservation biocontrol side, but this meta-analysis found that higher beneficial diversity may increase the effect of biocontrol. A couple other literature reviews that I looked at actually showed the opposite and showed that diversity didn't matter at all. So this is once again probably depends on what kind of pests in your environment. If you have a really diverse array of pests, which some of us do, and if you're in a warmer climate, that the diversity of pests as well as beneficials tends to go up. But if you have more kinds of pests, more kinds of different species of control agents are probably going to control them better. And not just diversity of species, also diversity of functional groups. So your predators are often going to be ground dwelling, like this ground beetle here, and are might affect more your like soil dwelling pests. And then your parasitoids might be affecting more of your like foliar, leaf dwelling pests. Your predatory mites might be affecting your mites. So beneficials aren't all created equal. Um, so this was another literature review specifically looking at predators, and this once again just showed that predators did have a significant effect both on reducing pest populations and increasing crop yield. So when you're thinking about once again kind of like conservation biocontrol and how you can manage your fields or gardens better to have better populations of beneficials, you got to factor in how you spray pesticides into that system. Um, so sometimes when you spray for a pest, you might also knock down populations of predators. And while you might not see an initial effect of that, sometimes the next year there might not be enough predators to suppress the pest population, maybe not even of the pest you were trying to control, but of other pests. And you might see a surgence of a pest that you never even thought about before come out of nowhere because you inadvertently knocked down the beneficials that you weren't even trying to affect. So this study here, it was done out of Australia, and it showed this field where they were doing crop rotations between canola and some other crop. It might have been like a grain. I don't remember exactly what it was, but they sprayed some organophosphates, and that knocked down both the pest populations and the beneficials, and everything was fine and dandy for like a couple years across a couple of crop rotations. Then all of a sudden, the slug population exploded and caused yield reduction in the canola fields because they got rid of the beetles that were controlling the slugs, and also even though you were controlling some of the insects, those pesticides might not have worked on those slugs as well. So they were doing really great with no competition and no predators. So all of these kinds of control, cultural, biological, chemical, they all work together, and you kind of have, even though there's like that pyramid that we show, they're really all kind of a circle and they all affect one another. Um, so yeah, spray with caution. This is kind of a interesting thing that you probably wouldn't hear about if this talk wasn't made by Desiree, but this is actually from some of her research. And the beneficial effect of pet predators isn't necessarily just from the predators eating your pests. sometimes just the presence of predators, maybe not even predators that will eat your pest, but sometimes just them being around will actually make your pests like nervous. That's a little bit of an anthropomorphization. I'm using quotes here, but it'll actually cause your pests to eat less or become less active or even become less healthy. And this is something that Desiree has shown in her research, specifically with bill bugs, which are kind of weevil that attacks turf grass. And I think the presence of spiders in particular is one of the things that actually cause these weevils to become less significant pests, even if they weren't necessarily eating the weevils themselves. And that kind of intuitively makes sense. Like, if you have a bunch of deer around and you also have a bunch of like dogs or even wolves or whatever, those deer are not going to be as bold and cavalier in terms of going out and feeding as they would be if there's no predators around, right? And this is just, a little extract from her research. This graph here is just showing that there's a pretty significant difference in the presence of predators versus not predators in terms of these bill bugs feeding as frequently. So once again, that's your plug for your conservation biocontrol, you know, holistic effects of predators, even sometimes if a predator isn't specialized to attack your pest, it might be having these sort of side effects that are helping reduce your pest damage that you might not even think about. So dialing in into some specific strategies that we can do to um, augment our beneficials from like a conservation biocontrol perspective. So this is kind of like the bottom pillar of um, you know, intensive managing for conservation biocontrol, you want to provide habitat, right? Flowering plants, a lot of these beneficials do feed on nectar or pollen, just like your pollinator, just like your pollinators and your bees and all that do. A lot of the beetles, the lacewings and all that, a lot of them feed or will take nectar as well, on the side in addition to eating other insects. Bonus points if they're natives, and that's really important because if you're planting native plants around your field, that's also probably going to help your native beneficials more, which are probably going to be some of the ones that are the most common in your environment, especially if you're in a place like Boundary County or Idaho that has a lot of interface between like native habitat and agricultural habitat. If you're planting natives in your field, that's going to draw even more of those native beneficial arthropods out of the wild and into your field. Um, Maybe a little bit less important in a highly altered crop system like Iowa, but really a thing to think about here, I would say, especially. Season-long shelter and food. Um, so providing places for your beneficials to exist in your environment. And once again, especially if you're using some kind of chemical control, you want to create like little refugia for those beneficials, maybe so that they're not even being as impacted by the pesticides as much. Um, so I don't know exactly what Desiree I want to talk about on that last slide, but talking about a little bit more specific examples, sometimes people actually specifically create some of these things like beetle banks where they'll plant strips of, it could be grass, it could be wildflowers in between their crops to specifically create habitat for beneficials. And they might not spray those, or they might spray them with a very low impact targeted pesticide that's only going to affect foliar feeding insects. Another thing is like um, trees planted along the edge of environments has been shown statistically to increase both pollinators and beneficial habitats, beneficial predators and parasitoids. So once again, some of these also will have beneficial effects besides just increasing predators and parasitoids that are going to control your pests. Some of them will also benefit pollinators, some will benefit other beneficials. And providing overwintering sites, especially if you know that there's some specific beneficials in your area that might be overwintering specific habitat. So this could be something like, just gardening or farming a little bit messier in some ways and just leaving some organic material on the ground in or near your fields to create some habitat for these beneficials. This is an example specifically for creating habitat for stem nesting bees. which once again, that's more of like on the pollinator side of beneficials. And there's no bees that like eat pests, at least not in our part of the world. But still an important thing to be thinking about. I mean, especially to this audience, I don't think I really need to plug the importance of bees as pollinators. But yeah, in terms of providing overwintering sites, a lot of insects and arthropods overwinter in just like organic material of various kinds. So like sod, leaf litter, even like old pieces of wood are not even a bad thing to leave, just a couple pieces around your field. A lot of different kinds of these beetles and stuff will use that as a larval habitat. Same thing with rocky crevices. A lot of those are habitats for beneficial insects. This is once again talking mostly about bees, which is more on the pollinator side, but also true for a lot of predatory beetles and things of that nature. And minimizing soil disturbance, maybe using a lower intensity tillage regime, that kind of thing is also going to preserve your beneficials. And once again, consider maybe not raking up all the leaves or other organic substrate around your field. It's a great refugia for beneficials. Leaves also provide like some insulation for the soil. So sometimes when you rake them off, it creates colder temperatures that will kill off more of those taxa. And a lot of the time, this is also true for your pests as well. So it is kind of this, knowing what beneficials you have in your environment, knowing what pests you have in your environment. And there's always kind of a trade-off between those things. But in general, things that will benefit your beneficials will also benefit your pests. But in benefiting your beneficials, you're also decreasing your pest population. So it hopefully all balances out in the end. And then once again, circling back to a safe, beneficial pesticide use. So if you're going to want to preserve your beneficials in your environments, you're going to want to use the most low impact kind of sprays that you can. Choose softer chemistries if you can. Some examples of that include like, your plant oils, your plant soaps, things like BT, which is highly specialized to affect certain groups of insects. And, a lot of times you use BT to attack like caterpillars or like aphids. And unlike a lot of other groups of insects, there's really no beneficial caterpillars or aphids from a agricultural standpoint. So you can use some of these more like softer or even organic pesticides to get rid of your like bad bugs and preserve some of your beneficial ones. Consider timing of pesticide application. Sometimes you'll have a time of year when your beneficial insects might be in their like adult stage and are flying around or are going to be more vulnerable to pesticide application. There's certain times of days when bees are more active. So if you have some information about that, you can use that to dial in your spray regime a little bit better. Once again, this can be difficult to dial in, right? Because there's so many different kinds of beneficials, there's so many different kinds of pests. It's hard to monitor for them in your field, but if you have a little bit of data about this, it is something to think about. And just general practices of good spray. Think about not having your pesticide drift into your neighboring environment. Obviously your neighbor is going to appreciate this, your human neighbor, but also, even just think about them going off into the weeds. Because if you're spraying insecticides into your weeds, a lot of beneficial insects do actually live in those like strips of weedy habitat that tend to spring up near agricultural fields. Sometimes, leaving some areas untreated, and that also goes back to, not building up insecticide resistance, which I think we'll talk about more in the next seminar, but it will also preserve some beneficial populations. And following label instructions and properly disposing of chemicals, important broken record thing to say, but always, always do that whenever you're working with pesticides. So some general takeaways, biocontrol is messy, but it's important. I would really think about that conservation biocontrol because a lot of time those beneficials that are in your environment are probably doing a lot of benefit to reducing your pest populations that you're not even aware of until it's too late. If you're not thinking about providing habitat for them, or you're maybe spraying a little bit too broad spectrum of things, or you're not controlling how that affects, the weeds or area around your field. That can lead to something like that example from Australia, where everything looks fine for a couple of years, but then all of a sudden there's an outbreak of this pest that you've never even seen before, and you're like, where did this come from? And turns out it was always there. And you know, the reduction of other pests and reduction of beneficials might have allowed it to explode. Uh, Understanding the life cycle and identify both your beneficials so that you're not spraying for them, because you look at this big eye bug and you might, not be knowledgeable about it and you think, oh, that's a lygus bug and I need to control for it. And then you spray and you just eliminated your beneficials. Um, and obviously understanding life cycle, super important, especially for introducing augmentative biocontrol. You're going to want to introduce at the right time when your pest is at the right stage of their life cycle and when your beneficials at the right stage of their life cycle. So you want to introduce lady beetle larvae when there's a lot of aphids that are feeding in their colony stage, not when they're flying off to other plants, and you're probably not going to release as many like adult lady beetles that have the best effect on controlling your aphids. And think about your beneficial populations when you're applying pesticides and how that's going to affect your beneficial populations. So yeah, that's our webinar for today, and I will take any questions. And I think Colette might have a follow-up seminar for you guys as well.
Thank you, Samuel. We do have a question, and I think question is referring to that fear factor that you talked about. So Lisa is asking, has anyone tried installing fake predators like plastic spiders to achieve that fear effect?
Yeah, I have never heard of that. It's certainly an interesting idea. I think in practice, installing enough fake plastic spiders, assuming something like that would even work, is probably going to just be a lot more expensive and difficult to implement than just trying to increase the populations of the spiders that are already there, or even maybe introducing some spiders. But yeah, it's interesting idea at the very least, for sure.
Thank you. Lisa has another question. Is there a standardized approach to most effectively monitor what and how many beneficials you have? Or is it just go out at different times of day and look at your plants and soil?
Yeah. Unfortunately, there is not like a standardized way. There are certainly some ways that I would recommend. Um, Depending on what scale you're working at, if you're a home gardener, I would say just putting out some yellow sticky traps, which you can order online, is great, and that will help you monitor your like leaf dwelling or like your foliar beneficials and pests. And then for the soil side, you can put out some pitfall traps, which are basically you could just get a cup and put a little bit of like soapy water or whatever in there, and then plant it or dig it into your soil and have it so that the rim is flush and bugs and pests will passively crawl in there. So that will show you what your soil dwelling population of pests and beneficials looks like. So yeah, I would start there, and visual inspection is important too. Just looking at your plants and seeing what's crawling around on there. Good place to start.
Great.
Yeah, I would say, if you're interested in implementing that, reaching out to your local extension office, they can probably provide some more localized and specific examples.
Great. Thank you. I think that's all the questions that have come in. So before we wrap up, I am just going to launch our last poll for today. And we're just wondering, after participating in this webinar, how much did your knowledge of biological pest control methods increase? So we have significant increase, moderate increase, or no increase. So I'll just give you a couple more seconds to complete that poll. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So everyone on today's webinar is either saying that they had a significant increase in their understanding of biological pest control or a moderate increase. So that's great to know. Thank you again, Samuel, for giving this presentation today and for your time and commitment to the Cultivating Success webinar series. We have one additional webinar, which is going to be next Tuesday. That is going to focus on the role of chemical control in integrated pest management and then developing integrated pest management plans. That webinar is available for a pesticide credit. So if you have not registered and you want to register for that webinar, you can visit cultivatingsuccess.org. We thank you for joining us today. Thank you again for your great presentation, Samuel, and have a great weekend, everyone. We will see you next Tuesday for our final webinar in this series.